The Albright mansion felt like a mausoleum, vast and silent, suffocated by the cloying scent of sympathy lilies. For 3 days since her father's passing, Sarah Albright had moved through its opulent halls like a ghost, her grief a heavy cloak she couldn't remove. Every gleaming surface, every piece of art, every heavy velvet drape was a testament to Richard Albright's immense success. But to Sarah, they were just silent witnesses to her profound loss. She remembered not the titan of industry, but the man whose hand she held, whose favorite novels she read aloud when his eyes grew tired, and whose quiet gratitude was the only payment she ever sought. She had put her career as a curator on hold, her life shrinking to the walls of this house to ensure his final years were filled with comfort and love. This somber peace, however, was not shared. Her stepmother, Carol Jennings, swept through the rooms with a brittle energy, her black designer dress more of a fashion statement than a sign of mourning. Her grief was a performance, a series of side pronouncements to visiting neighbors about how devastated she was, only to turn and snap at the housekeeping staff moments later. Her children, Chad and Tiffany, were worse. They treated the home like a resort they were about to inherit. Chad, a man whose ambition had always outstripped his talent, was already talking about converting the library into a state-of-the-art media room. Tiffany, who had never held a job for more than a few months, spent her time scrolling through luxury, travel websites on her phone, occasionally looking up to complain about the morbid atmosphere. "Honestly, Sarah," Carol said, finding her in the sunroom, staring out at her father's beloved rose garden, "you need to pull yourself together. Richard wouldn't want all this moping. It's dreadfully dreary." Carol's voice was sharp, a scalpel dissecting Sarah's sorrow. "We have the reading tomorrow. You should think about what you're going to wear. Something appropriate." The implication was clear. Sarah, in her simple black sweater and slacks, was an embarrassment. She had always been an embarrassment to them. When she'd chosen to care for her father instead of attending galas, she was neglecting her social duties. When she spoke of her work in art history, they exchanged bored glances. They saw her as a glorified servant, a plain, uninteresting fixture in the house they couldn't wait to redesign. "I'll be fine, Carol," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. She refused to give them the satisfaction of her tears. Later that evening, as Chad argued with Tiffany over who would get the vintage Porsche in the garage, Sarah saw her father's face in a silver-framed photograph on the mantel. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. For a moment, she felt a surge of panic. He had been her shield, the only reason she had a place in this house. Without him, she was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of vipers who wore her family name. The air in the mansion was thick with anticipation, not of loss, but of gain. And as the silence of the night settled, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the storm about to break would be far more devastating than she could ever imagine. The quiet was over. The 48 hours leading up to the will reading were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Carol, Chad, and Tiffany had shed the last pretense of mourning and were now behaving like lottery winners waiting for the oversized check. The mansion, once a sanctuary for Sarah and her father, now felt alien territory, a house of strangers she no longer recognized. One morning, she walked into the formal dining room to find Carol on the phone with an auction house, discussing the market value of 18th century French tapestries. She winked at Sarah as she spoke into the receiver. "Yes, they're in pristine condition. My late husband had impeccable taste." Chad had taken to walking around with a measuring tape, his footsteps echoing with audacious entitlement. "This wall could easily accommodate a 90-inch screen," he declared to his sister, who was lounging on a chaise, busy configuring a custom Italian sports car on her tablet. Dad never understood modern entertainment. Sarah felt an invisible wall closing in around her. Her grief was an inconvenience, her presence a temporary problem to be managed until she could be discarded. She retreated to her father's study, the one room they seemed to be avoiding. The scent of old books and leather was a balm to her frayed nerves. She ran her hand over the spine of his favorite copy of Moby Dick, its pages worn and soft from a lifetime of reading. This was her father. Not the assets and accounts they were so eager to claim, but this quiet, intellectual man who had taught her to see the world with wonder. "What am I going to do, Dad?" she whispered into the silence. Her only respite came from an unexpected source. While walking through the grounds, trying to clear her head, she saw Samuel Henderson, the gardener, tending to the roses near the west terrace. He was a quiet, weathered man who had worked for her father for over 30 years. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his hands calloused from decades of work, treating each bloom with reverence. He looked up as she approached, his kind eyes crinkling in a sad smile. He removed his worn leather gloves. "Morning, Miss Sarah." "Good morning, Samuel," she said, managing a small smile of her own. "These were his favorites," Samuel said, gesturing to a row of deep red roses. "The Mr. Lincoln. He said they were dignified." He paused, looking at her with genuine sympathy. "He was a good man. Talked about you all the time, you know. Said you were his rock." He then added, so softly she almost missed it, "He loved you very much. Don't you ever forget that?" Tears pricked Sarah's eyes, the first she'd allowed herself to shed in front of anyone. Here, from a man who asked for nothing, was the validation and kindness her own family denied her. "Thank you, Samuel," she managed to say. "That means more than you know." As she walked back toward the house, the simple words felt like a small piece of armor. It wasn't much, but as she prepared to face the next day, she would cling to it with all her might. The law offices of Davies, Finch and Associates were located on the top floor of a glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The boardroom was a sterile, intimidating space, dominated by a colossal mahogany table polished to a mirror shine. The air was cold, smelling of money and recycled air. Sarah sat alone on one side of the table, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the flamboyant funereal couture of her stepfamily. Carol sat directly opposite, flanked by Chad and Tiffany, a triumphant smirk already playing on her lips. She looked like a queen holding court. Mr. Davies, a stern man in his late 60s, with a face like etched granite, entered the room carrying a slim leather portfolio. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "We are gathered today for the reading of the last will and testament of Richard C. Albright," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "Carol, you have provided me with the document you attest to be his final will, signed and notarized." Carol gave a slight, regal nod. "Of course, Richard entrusted it to me." Mr. Regal nod. Davies put on his reading glasses and began to drone through the legal jargon. It was swift and brutal. The Albright estate, valued at over $100 million, including the primary residence, all properties, stock portfolios, and art collections, was to be left in its entirety to his beloved wife, Carol Jennings. In the event of her death, it would be divided equally between her children, Chad Jennings and Tiffany Jennings. Sarah's name was not mentioned. She felt the blood drain from her face, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. It wasn't about the money, it was the complete and utter erasure of her existence, of her father's love for her. "And one final clause," Mr. Davies said, peering over his glasses as if for dramatic effect. "To my daughter, Sarah Albright, for all her troubles during my final years, I bequeath the sum of $1. A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, came from Chad and Tiffany. Carol's smirk widened into a full-blown, venomous smile. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a crisp dollar bill, and with a flourish, slid it across the vast, polished expanse of the table. It came to a stop directly in front of Sarah. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing the air from her lungs. The single dollar was not a bequest. It was a final public slap in the face. It was a message, carefully crafted by Carol, to codify her status as worthless. Her vision tunneled, the faces of her stepfamily blurring into a grotesque tableau of greed and victory. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah felt nothing but a profound, crushing emptiness. She was a stranger, a servant, and now, officially, she was worth a single dollar. She slowly reached out a trembling hand and picked it up. The air in the boardroom was thick with triumph. Carol leaned back in her chair, the very picture of satisfaction, while Chad whispered excitedly to Tiffany about a celebratory trip to Monaco. Mr. Davies, the lawyer, began shuffling his papers, preparing to conclude the meeting that had so effectively and cruelly dismantled Sarah's life. He cleared his throat. "Well, if there are no further—" Excuse me. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with the clarity of a ringing bell. It was calm, steady, and utterly unexpected. Everyone turned towards the back of the room. Standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his posture radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity, was Samuel Henderson. His work boots seemed out of place on the plush carpet, but his gaze was firm. Carol was the first to recover from the shock, her face contorting with disdain. "Samuel, what on earth are you doing here? This is a private family matter. Who let the help in?" She waved a dismissive hand. "Mr. Davies, please have security remove him." Mr. Davies looked flustered, his professional composure cracking for the first time. "Mr. Henderson, this is indeed a private meeting." Samuel took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the lawyer. He ignored Carol completely. "I was invited, sir, by Mr. Richard Albright himself." He held up a hand to forestall any further objections. "He asked me to be here today. He said it was very important." Chad scoffed loudly. "My father? Don't be ridiculous. He was barely lucid at the end. He probably thought you were the president." Tiffany giggled beside him. Sarah stared at the old gardener, a flicker of something she dared not name. Hope igniting in her chest. She remembered his kindness, his simple words of comfort. He had been her father's confidant in the garden for decades, a silent observer of their family's dynamics. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Mr. Davies said, his voice regaining its authority. "I understand, sir," Samuel said, his voice remaining even. "But before I do, I am obligated to carry out my employer's final instruction." He reached inside his modest tweed jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. "The document you just read," he said, his gaze finally shifting to Carol, whose face was a mask of furious indignation, "is a fraud." The accusation hung in the air, electric and stunning. "And Mr. Albright," Samuel Henderson continued, his voice ringing with absolute certainty as he pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from his jacket, entrusted me with his true last will and testament. A stunned, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. Carol's face, moments before flushed with victory, had turned a pasty, mottled white. "That's preposterous!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "He's just a gardener. He's delusional. Mr. Davies, do your job." But Mr. Davies was no longer looking at Carol. His eyes were fixed on the envelope in Samuel Henderson's hand. It was made of heavy, expensive stock and sealed on the back with a perfect circle of dark red wax, impressed with the distinctive Albright family crest, a stylized A entwined with an oak leaf. It was a seal the lawyer had seen Richard Albright use hundreds of times on important personal correspondence. His professional duty, rigid and absolute, superseded Carol's frantic protests. "May I see that, Mr. Henderson?" Davies asked, his voice a low murmur. Samuel walked forward and placed the envelope on the polished table. The lawyer picked it up, examining the unbroken seal, the weight of the paper, and the familiar, elegant scrawl on the front. "To be opened only upon my death by my legal counsel, in the presence of my daughter, Sarah Albright." With a small, sharp letter opener, Mr. Davies sliced the seal. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. He unfolded the pages within and began to read, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. He cleared his throat. "This document is indeed signed by Richard C. Albright, witnessed by 2 attending nurses from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and dated 1 week after the document previously presented. It legally supersedes all prior versions." He looked directly at Sarah, a hint of something like compassion in his professional gaze. "It begins with a personal letter. To you, Sarah." He began to read Richard Albright's words, his voice filling the sterile office with a warmth and love that had been so absent. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and I pray you are not alone in your grief. Forgive an old man's sentimentality, but my final words must be for you, the sole treasure of my life. For years, I have watched you sacrifice your own dreams to brighten my twilight. You brought me books when my world grew small. You brought me laughter when my days grew quiet. And you brought me love when others brought only obligation. You did not see a fortune to be seized. You saw a father to be cherished. I saw your quiet strength as Carol and her children treated you with a cruelty I was too weak, too ill to properly fight. My greatest regret is not shielding you better from their greed, a greed I knew would reach its peak the moment I was gone. Tears streamed freely down Sarah's face, but they were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of validation, of a love returned from beyond the grave. Each word was a healing balm on the wound her stepfamily had just inflicted. The letter continued. That is why I created this final, true testament, and entrusted it not to those who shared my house, but to the only man I knew I could trust implicitly, Samuel Henderson, whose honesty, like my roses, has bloomed in this garden for 30 years. Honesty, he has been a better friend to me than most. Now for the final dispositions of my estate. Mr. Davies paused, taking a deliberate breath before continuing to read from Richard Albright's true will. The personal, loving tone of the letter shifted, replaced by the precise and unyielding language of legal decree. The air crackled with tension. Chad had gone rigid in his seat, while Tiffany stared at her mother as if seeing her for the first time. First, the lawyer read, his voice resonating with the weight of the words, I hereby revoke any and all previous wills and testaments. This document represents my final and absolute wishes. He looked up from the page for a moment. I bequeath my entire estate, including all properties real and personal, all shares, bonds, and financial accounts, the entirety of Albright Industries, and all personal effects, to my beloved and devoted daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Albright. She is to be my sole heir and executor, Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sole heir. The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering and impossible. Carol shot to her feet. No, it's a forgery. The old fool and the gardener cooked this up. It's a lie. Please be seated, Mrs. Jennings, Mr. Davies said, his tone icy, or I will have you removed. The will is legally ironclad. He waited for a trembling Carol to sink back into her chair before continuing. The will goes on. Regarding my wife, Carol Jennings, and her children, Chad and Tiffany Jennings, I have made provisions for them for many years. However, let the record show that these were not gifts. A collective stillness fell over Carol's side of the table. For the past decade, Mr. Davies read, his eyes scanning the page. Every transfer of funds to them, for their businesses, their homes, their cars, and their extravagant lifestyles, has been legally structured as an advance against their future inheritance. I have kept a meticulous ledger, and for each major transaction, they have co-signed a promissory note acknowledging the sum as a loan to be settled by their portion of the estate upon my death. He paused, letting the implications sink in. The will continues. As my estate now leaves them with an inheritance of 0, these debts are not settled. They are, as of the reading of this will, due in full to my estate, now under the control of my executor, Sarah Albright. Mr. Davies looked up, his expression grim. The will includes an appended ledger. The total sum of these loans, principal plus accrued interest, is $27,480,000. The sound Tiffany made was a strangled sob. Chad looked like he was going to be physically ill, his face the color of ash. The entire foundation of their lives, the designer clothes, the luxury cars, the condescending arrogance, had been built on a mountain of debt they now owed to the very woman they had just humiliated with a single dollar. Their inheritance wasn't just nothing. It was a black hole of financial ruin. The revelation of the $27 million debt shattered the last vestiges of Carol's composure. The boardroom, once her stage of triumph, became the site of her spectacular undoing. Lies! It's all lies! She shrieked, her voice a raw, desperate thing. She lunged across the table as if to snatch the papers from the lawyer's hands, but Chad, white-faced and trembling, pulled her back. He would never do that. Those were gifts. He loved me. On the contrary, Mrs. Jennings, Mr. Davies said, his voice as cold and hard as the marble floor. He did do that. And you signed every single loan agreement. Your signatures, along with Chad's and Tiffany's, are on dozens of legally binding documents, all appended here. He tapped the thick stack of papers with a single, definitive finger. The estate's legal team will be in contact with you regarding a repayment schedule. I suggest you retain counsel. Immediately, Tiffany had dissolved into hysterical sobs, muttering, "My car! My apartment! It's all gone!" Chad just stared into space, the gears of his mind grinding to a halt as he processed the sheer, catastrophic scale of their ruin. The swagger and arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified man. But Richard Albright's final testament had one more blade to twist. Mr. Davies continued, his voice low and serious. "There is one final matter addressed here. It pertains to Mr. Albright's medical care in his last 6 months." He looked directly at Carol. "The will provides a sworn affidavit from one of your husband's nurses, along with copies of emails you sent, detailing your attempts to have his medication altered to increase his confusion and to gain a fraudulent power of attorney by misrepresenting his cognitive state to his doctors." If it were possible, Carol grew even paler. This was no longer just about money. This constitutes evidence of potential elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and medical mistreatment, the lawyer stated, his professional duty overriding any personal feeling. "As an officer of the court, I am legally and ethically obligated to turn this will and all its supporting documentation over to the district attorney's office." That was the final blow. Chaos erupted. Carol began screaming, a torrent of vitriol and denial directed at the impassive lawyer, at the ghost of her husband, at the silent, watching Samuel Henderson. The legal ramifications, investigations, charges, potential jail time, were a horror beyond their comprehension. Mr. Davies pressed a button on the intercom on his desk. "Helen, please send security to the main boardroom." Within moments, 2 uniformed security guards entered the room. Their presence was a final, stark symbol of the Jennings' complete fall from grace. They were no longer powerful, wealthy members of the elite. They were liabilities to be managed and removed. As the guards gently but firmly escorted the hysterical Carol, the weeping Tiffany, and the shell-shocked Chad from the room, their protests echoing down the hall, Sarah sat in the deafening silence. In her hand, she still clutched the single-dollar bill, no longer a mark of shame, but a token of the most profound victory she had ever known. 6 months later, the Albright mansion felt like home again. The oppressive atmosphere of greed had lifted, replaced by a quiet, productive calm. Sarah now sat at her father's large oak desk in the study, but it was hers now. The room was no longer a refuge from her family, but a command center from which she managed her father's legacy with a compassion and shrewdness that would have made him immensely proud. She had established a charitable foundation in his name, focusing on arts education for underprivileged youth, a cause he had always championed in private. This morning, she was signing one last check. It was for a generous, fully funded retirement package for Samuel Henderson. She had already helped him purchase a small, charming house in the countryside, with a sprawling yard perfect for a master gardener. "Are you sure this is enough, Samuel?" she had asked him when she presented the offer. He had simply smiled, his eyes kind. "Miss Sarah, your father gave me a good life. You have given me a peaceful future." "Sarah, that is more than enough." His quiet loyalty had been the key that unlocked everything, and she would never forget it. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Mr. Davies. "Good morning, Sarah. I have an update for you." "Good morning," she said, leaning back in her chair and gazing out at the garden, now bursting with spring color under Samuel's final tutelage before he left. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has officially filed charges against Carol, Chad, and Tiffany Jennings," the lawyer stated. "Based on the evidence your father provided and their own extensive investigation into their finances, the charges include wire fraud, conspiracy, and financial elder abuse. Given the mountain of evidence, they're facing significant prison time. Their assets have been frozen to begin repayment to the estate." A sense of final, quiet justice settled over Sarah. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about the truth her father had so carefully preserved, finally bearing fruit. Carol and her children had not just been defeated, they had been held accountable by the very laws they thought their money could help them ignore. Their punishment was complete. "Thank you for letting me know," Sarah said calmly. After the call, she walked out onto the terrace. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming roses. She looked over the magnificent garden, a living tapestry of her father's love and Samuel's care. For years she had felt like an unwanted weed in this place, struggling to survive in the shadows of others. But now, the ground was hers. The future was hers to cultivate. She took a deep breath, the sunlight warm on her face, and felt a profound sense of peace. The storm was over and it was time to start planting a new garden.